Hi, everyone. Okay, it's 10:05, so I think we are going to get started. Before we begin the session, I would like to begin by first acknowledging that we are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. I would like to recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. The culture and the presence of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation has nourished this land. I am grateful to the land and water protectors who continue to care for Turtle Island. I am deeply grateful to live as an uninvited guest in this territory. I would like us to call us all to thoughtfully and meaningfully reflect on the disproportionate experiences of violations of the right to housing on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, especially as we enter this discussion on homelessness and encampments, and as we continue our own journeys to relational accountability. So my name is Michelle Biss. I'm the National Director of the National Right to Housing Network, and I have the total pleasure of introducing this panel. So I'm going to start by calling up some of our colleagues here. I'd like to call up Reagan Sunshine Broussais. Reagan is a long-standing social justice activist in Waterloo Region and a co-creator of the Unsheltered campaign. In her spare time, she operates and maintains a website supporting grassroots information sharing and advocacy on anti-poverty and housing issues. I would also like to welcome, later in this presentation, a colleague. I'll do it right now. Perfect. Okay. I'm also going to introduce folks to Laura Pinn. Laura is an assistant professor of political science at Wilfrid Laurier University. She's a critical community engaged scholar, active in the areas of participatory democracy, local politics, housing policy, and homelessness. So take it away, Reagan and Laura.
Okay, just bear with us while we get our slides together. They're here, and it's all going to work, right? It's all going to work. Hey, look at that. It's working. So as Michelle mentioned, my name's Laura, and this is Reagan, and we're so pleased to be here today on this panel. We wanted to start our presentation with some acknowledgements. As Michelle mentioned, in Canada, discussions of housing, homelessness, and eviction are deeply intertwined with the forced displacement of Indigenous peoples from these lands. In Waterloo Region, this includes, which is where we're coming from, this includes the failure to honor the Haldimand Treaty of 1784. Working on housing and homelessness as settlers requires us to work towards more just relations with Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous peoples where we live and work. We also appreciate many of the informal conversations with community members who have experienced homelessness and housing precarity. We appreciate those conversations for helping share our views on these issues and reminding us that policy documents always only tell part of the story. We also appreciate the hard work of research assistants Valentina Orlinas and Sebastian McPherson, and we received some funding for this project from the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada. Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, in case anyone from SSHRC is here and making sure that we got that name right.
So we have some goals for our presentation today. We're looking to explore what does a human rights lens mean. We're looking to provide an overview of municipal policy responses in Ontario, to explore strengths and gaps of our current municipal approaches, and hopefully to provide some strategies of what could be done differently. Our key takeaway today is that at the center of this, we must rely on a human rights approach. Because while we can always do better than these minimum standards, we should never do worse than these basic requirements.
So this research is part of a project called Realizing the Right, Municipal Policy Responses to Encampments. It's a multi-year community-engaged project focused on a multi-dimensional understanding of how municipalities in Ontario are responding to encampments. For our presentation today, we're focusing on just part of this project, a neo-vagrancy bylaw and encampment protocol scan of all Ontario municipalities. And that was conducted in 2023 and 2024. Neo-vagrancy bylaws. So any regulation made by a municipal government that criminalizes survival behaviors commonly used by people experiencing homelessness. Neo-vagrancy bylaws commonly include anti-camping bylaws, anti-loitering. They may include prohibitions on cooking in parks, etc. These regulations have a direct impact on the day-to-day lives of people living in encampments. We also explored encampment protocols, which we're defining as any public text produced by a municipal government that provides guidance on how municipal actors should engage with encampments, including but not limited to the interpretation of bylaws. So protocols are more detail-oriented and include information typically not captured in bylaws, such as details on implementation and enforcement, or a process for providing outreach support. So we feel that bylaws and protocols are important to look at, given that they govern many interactions between municipal actors and people experiencing homelessness. They are key municipal documents guiding the local response to encampments and places where we would expect to see a human rights approach reflected or not reflected.
Well, written policy documents can provide insight into some things, such as policy objectives, the goals of the policy, then the included intended outcomes, the priorities, and the broader vision. It can't provide for all. So it's, good Lord, can I start that one over? So bylaws and protocols can provide insight into some things. They can provide insight into policy goals and objectives. They can provide insight into the legal frameworks, procedures, and processes, roles and responsibilities. But unfortunately, they cannot provide insight into everything. They can't tell us how those policies are actually implemented. There's often a gap between what is written and how policies are executed on the ground, influenced by local actors, resources, or administrative capabilities and capacities. They cannot tell us about the lived effects of policies on people, how policies actually affect the day-to-day lives and decisions of people on the ground is rarely captured within the written policy documents. They cannot tell us about the role of unwritten norms. There we go. There's many important elements of policy decision making that are unwritten or informal. There's the power dynamics, the lobbying, the behind the scenes negotiations that may not be documented, but they significantly influence policy outcomes. They also cannot tell us about other operational strategies that may be able to assist. So what other measures may already exist that could be used? We'll go with that.
Yeah. And so on this slide, we have a lesson concerning the limitations of official policies and protocols, an example from the city of Kitchener. So in the spring of 2023, many of the city's written documents explaining how they approached encampments emphasized a human rights approach. But at the same time, there was an encampment in the city of Kitchener in a park that was fenced in. So literally there was a fence surrounding people there, and folks were pressured to, quote, voluntarily leave. And 3 people who had been present at the camp on and off were arrested for trying to access the space, including one person who's actually right here in this room listening to this presentation right now, who could tell you a lot more about it. I'm just going to really briefly cover it here. So the moral of the story is that written documents are not necessarily in keeping with what's happening in the ground. So we've told you all the reasons why what we're talking about is limited today, but we also think they are important, right, in terms of providing guidance for those interactions between people experiencing homelessness and municipal actors. So in terms of how we went about this, we developed a municipal encampment policy framework, drawing on a number of documents that have been created by very smart people over the last few years, including the National Protocol on Encampments and the Decampment Report Card, which was done by the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, the Ontario Human Rights Commission Statement on Encampments, as well as work by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, who is here today. And really, we were trying to get at two key questions. What do human rights compliant encampment policies look like at the municipal level? And how can we translate broad human rights frameworks to the municipal policy context, right? So taking these high-level documents, what questions should we be asking of these municipal policy documents to really understand whether or not they're consistent with a rights-based approach?
So we explored municipal policy themes with members of both the Project Advisory Committee and our local community. I'd like to take a moment just to recognize the work of these contributors in helping us think through what a human rights lens could look like on the ground. So together we basically identified 5 themes. The themes that we chose to focus towards were decentering policing and law enforcement, addressing the conditions in encampments and meeting basic needs, equitable and accessible provision of services, ensuring the meaningful participation of encampment residents, and of course, recognizing the distinct rights of our Indigenous peoples. To assess protocols in context insofar as possible through written documents, we did a search of all municipalities in Ontario, over 80,000 in population, for publicly available encampment protocols and neo-vagrancy bylaws. This left us with 41 municipalities. We conducted this scan twice, once in October to December of 23 and again in June to August of 24. We excluded counties because they don't have their own bylaws, and that left us with 37 municipalities. An assessment of the municipalities with protocols according to the theoretical framework, we looked at the qualitative assessment capturing complexity of different dimensions and included supplementary materials such as public communications regarding encampments and information in staff reports.
So we briefly want to go through our different themes. And again, I want to emphasize that all of the municipalities we looked at had some form of neo-vagrancy bylaw, which is super relevant to the first theme of decenter policing and enforcement. Because by having neo-vagrancy bylaws in place, that makes encampments a bylaw issue, an enforcement issue, rather than necessarily a service provision issue or a human rights issue. So 32 municipalities we found included an explicit prohibition on sleeping or sheltering in public spaces. Most municipalities have responded, so in terms of having encampment protocols, with either selective enforcement of anti-sheltering or anti-sleeping bylaws. So if, for example, there's this informal direction to not enforce them, or delayed enforcement, so informal direction to not enforce them for a period of time. We were not able to find any municipality that actually repealed, and so even if the encampment protocol said we're taking a human rights approach, we didn't find any municipality that repealed anti-sheltering or anti-sleeping bylaws, which means that still the behavior was rendered a bylaw issue, even if the protocol outlined a more services-first approach. We generally found that protocols outlined 3 levels of bylaw and police engagement. So a set of protocols assessed bylaw and police as leading the response. So the first person that was contacted when an encampment was identified was bylaw or police. The second set identified bylaw and police alongside service provision. So bylaw and police would be called alongside service providers, and the third subset was a group of protocols that identified service provider-led responses without explicitly stating that bylaw and police would be present. And so, of course, this third subset is the one that's most consistent with decentering police and law enforcement from encampment responses. We're going to have a few promising practices sprinkled throughout. And so again, with that caveat that we don't know, unless it's, there's a few municipalities we're doing case studies of, we don't know what this looks like on the ground. However, it's promising in terms of setting up a policy framework that enables a more human rights-based response. So the City of Thunder Bay is one of the few municipalities that does not have a bylaw prohibiting sheltering or sleeping in parks. And they actually considered creating one and decided not to because of concerns around how that would impact people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And the response, according to the protocol there, is led by a community partner, not necessarily bylaw and police. We also have a few examples of what we're going to call yikes practices, and we haven't identified the cities here, though if you're kind of nerdy like us and you're reading these protocol documents, you might know which ones these are. So City 1, law enforcement makes first contact to determine if bylaws are violated, which they are because the bylaws are in place prohibiting sheltering and sleeping, and then seeks voluntary compliance to dismantle structures. So this is concerning because what this actually is saying in nicer words is we are going to force displacement. We are going to force eviction, which is not consistent with the human rights approach. City 2, street outreach and bylaw are first responders. Upon identifying an encampment, bylaw staff will issue a 6-hour notice of trespass. When bylaw cannot respond, example, they're unavailable, the police services respond. So again, not consistent with a human rights-based approach, treating encampments as a bylaw issue, not a housing issue, and a 6-hour notice of trespass. There's been lots of research on the harms done when people are forced to displace and relocate, especially with tight timelines and without adequate work to identify alternative locations.
So for theme 2, we looked at addressing conditions and basic needs. We found that there were very few protocols that outlined a plan for addressing conditions in encampment and providing basic services. So for example, sanitation, potable water, garbage removal, safe haven, things that people need just to get by on the basic level. These are not frivolities. They are basic needs. When these issues are addressed, there's a lack of clarity concerning what standards apply and how they're to be accessed. With some exceptions, the plan for addressing environmental and safety concerns is through forced closure. So when these concerns are encountered, instead of actually addressing the issues, they force the individuals to relocate. Really doesn't help. I just want to point out, this was the photo on here was a method that was being used to collect water at COVID onset, to have people wash their hands and drink when everything shut down. These people are innovative. But this is not how it should be here. So one of our promising practices that we looked towards was the City of London. They've chosen to operate service depots at some encampment sites daily, helping to provide access to safe, clean drinking water, access to hygiene and sanitation facilities. They've offered resources for fire safety. They've offered waste management systems, access to social supports and services, as well as harm reduction, and resources for food and food safety. These are the critical items. I'm guessing everybody in this room has access to them every single day. Oh, that's purple, that's you. Oh. No, it's not, it says Reagan.
It says Reagan.
Yeah,
It's the
Reagan.
dot's the wrong color.
Oh, no, because that was the weird one, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Mid-presentation break. Okay, so the third theme we wanted to identify was equitable and accessible services. And so I want to note that all 12 municipal encampment protocols that we found did discuss service provision to some extent, typically in terms of connection to housing, health, and harm reduction services. So there was attention to this issue. And two specific ways we did see protocols address equity and accessibility. So equitable provision. Some protocols do discuss trauma-informed and culturally appropriate service provision. So understanding what kinds of service provision are necessary to actually be equitably providing services to folks in encampment. And then accessible provision, some protocols discuss bringing services directly to people on site. So rather than assuming that people at encampments will go somewhere to access housing services, actually bringing housing workers to the encampment site.
I don't think we changed all the circle colors. Okay, there's no circle. So one of the promising practices that I really enjoy is for my hometown, or home region. And one thing that we've seen in the region of Waterloo is that when they chose to add a anti-hate and harassment provision in their code of use bylaw, prohibiting discrimination while on their properties, they opted to include in the list of protected grounds, socioeconomic status, and housing status. To me, that's a big leap forward. That's offering the opportunity for people to be recognized as these situational factors not being something they should be discriminated against, and it's in their codified content. That's you.
Okay. Theme 3, we have a couple yikes practices here. City number 1, if people in encampments do not complete the VI SPDAT. How many people have heard of the SPDAT in this room? Yeah, right? They may not be connected with housing resources and support. So this is concerning because it implies that if people are not willing to complete this tool, which asks for really invasive information, and there's been research showing that it's discriminatory in application as well, that they won't be able to access housing resources and support, right? They might be labeled as difficult, they might not be considered for particular programs, so we find that concerning in terms of equitable and accessible service provision. Yikes practice number 2, repeatedly refusing services may lead municipal authorities to forcefully displace residents from their encampment site. So if people at an encampment site refuse services, so again, not respecting people's autonomy and service access, but yeah, if people refuse them, that can be part of the grounds that they use to judge whether there needs to be a forced closure. So we also find that concerning as well because it disrespects, both of these examples disrespect the personal agency of the individual. For theme 4, meaningful participation, we noted 2 common trends. The first was that there was no meaningful engagement described, so obviously that's concerning from a human rights perspective. So no information, and I want to say that we didn't just look at the protocols, we searched staff reports, websites, media, we tried really hard to find evidence, and often we could not. The second trend is that there's some engagement or consultation of encampment residents, but there's no accountability. So it says we spoke with people, but it doesn't say how it was influencing the final protocol or documents. Or even there's no report of what people said, what the feedback was. And then the third thing we noted was that often decision-making concerning the future of an encampment was typically vested with high-level municipal staff, sometimes in collaboration with multi-agency planning tables, but really never with people who are actually staying in encampments having decision-making power around that. So again, really limited in terms of meaningful participation. And unfortunately, we don't have any promising practices to share here. We also didn't really need to do yikes practices because the whole slide was kind of a yikes practice. And the last theme, recognition of Indigenous rights. So we only reviewed one protocol that included recognition of Indigenous rights and rights obligations that all levels of government have to Indigenous peoples in Canada. Several protocols did include discussion of culturally specific services and partnering with Indigenous service providers. However, it was not necessarily clear how this engagement affected the encampment response, and this is one of those areas where I think policy can only take us so far. We really need to be seeing, talking to people on the ground to understand that better. Most commonly, though, there was no reference to Indigenous rights or Indigenous-led models of engagement in the protocols that we reviewed. And we do have 2 promising practices we'll note here. In the city of Brantford, they explicitly state that Brantford Native housing is the first point of contact for people who are Indigenous residing in encampments. So again, trying to integrate that appropriate service provision right from that first interaction. And then the City of Sudbury's protocol does talk about the 12 dimensions of Indigenous housing, so Jessie Thistle's work, and how these should be considered to help frame the response, to acknowledge that there are aspects of homelessness for Indigenous people that differ from non-Indigenous people.
We forgot halfway through to change colors. So overall, our notes are, even when they make general statements about a human rights approach in the preamble, most municipal encampment policies of Ontario are not adequately taking into account the human rights approach, especially in terms of their failure to recognize a human rights approach requires an immediate step, immediately offered, to meet the basic needs, including using public infrastructure to support these individuals should we need to. There's a failure to understand encampments as a rights issue, not a bylaw issue. Pressing, given the legal context. Well, I messed up my comma there. Failure to meaningfully integrate the perspectives of encampment residents into the process, and a failure to address Indigenous rights.
Can I chime in and say something?
Yep.
I think, too, one of the things about the legal context, how many people are here from a municipality? Oh boy, we're going to get some harsh questions at the end. But really, honestly, there have been so many court cases that have found that forced eviction is not human rights compliant, right? And it's more complicated than that. But one of the key things is that, this approach of just telling people to get out and move along is no longer one that municipalities can use. And so there's a need to adapt to the changing context and our growing recognition that that kind of approach is not rights compliant.
So the emphasis on eliminating, removing, or prohibiting encampments is there. And there's not a lot in there showing what we could be doing to create and to support better safety for the residents in these locations. Biggest thing is we're finding them to be punitive, yet quite often seeking to be framed as a compassionate approach. Respectfully, quite performative. I just want to bring us back to the key takeaway, because this is one thing I want to make sure everybody here remembers. At the center of all this, we must rely on a human rights approach. While we can always do better than these minimum standards, we should never be doing worse than these basic requirements. And a whole bunch of places you can check out.
Including Reagan's website, where we'll be posting our slides from this presentation as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura and Reagan. Laura and Reagan, I was going to propose that we maybe see if there's like 5 minutes of questions specific to your presentation. And then once we've taken those 5 minutes of questions, then we'll flip it over to our second presentation. Does that sound good to folks? Okay, Julian, go for it.
So I'm going to ask, I'm going to make a preamble, and out of that I'm going to get to the question. So the preamble is that the UN Charter of Human Rights was created after World War II, when the Soviet Union and the US both had views of how the world should be. The US believed in like individual rights, and the Soviet Union believed in economic rights. So this charter was created, and the idea of a human right is that you have a human right by virtue of being human. So it's not something that's given to you. It's not something that Doug Ford says, oh, these people aren't trying, whatever. It doesn't matter if you're good, if you're bad, if you're hardworking or deserving or undeserving. Because you are a human, you have basic human rights. And these rights include the right to housing, decent housing fit for human beings. The reason we build encampments isn't because we want people to live in tents, it's that we want people to live in houses. That for housing to happen, we need to have sovereignty. And sovereignty starts at the home, at the basic unit of the home. A home isn't a building, a home is a decision-making body. The smallest decision-making body of a group of people that live together and are masters of their own castle, so to say. And so that's also very, very important. When we hear all these people talking, like there's two things that piss me off. First thing is we hear all these people, like you were saying, it's a very positive thing that the city of Kitchener mentions the fact that like they can't discriminate on the basis of socioeconomic barriers and stuff. Yet every day we see the police outside the social development center roasting people, arresting people, carding people, or holding people on petty charges for like months with conditions of non-associations, no free speech, no political action, etc., etc., etc. These are just platitudes. So, and like saying something at the beginning that we recognize that this is the land of this and this nation, now let's move on and implement the Canadian government's whole agenda of assimilation, which is still there. Like the idea of truth and reconciliation was like first started in South Africa and Ireland as a way of being like, okay, you can keep your culture, you can keep your language, but fuck your mineral rights, fuck your land rights, fuck your water rights, this and this and this.
Yeah.
So I'm not interested in platitudes. How do we go? I think platitudes are actually dangerous. To say that it's like to say that Kitchener has a human rights approach is false, right? To say that they don't discriminate on socioeconomic or even to put it there.
But Julian, we totally agree, right? We wouldn't have said that, you know, and we.
Okay, that was the
Yeah.
preamble. The
Okay.
question is, how do we go from empty language that does nothing to concrete action where we mobilize the people themselves to express sovereignty and become the decision makers?
Well, by golly, Julian, if I knew that, we wouldn't need this conference. I'd just tell everybody.
I have a couple ideas.
Well, I know, me too, man. We'll talk. I guess the one thing I want to say, and I want to make it clear for anybody who misunderstood this in the room, I do think that the anti-hate bylaw that was mentioned is a positive step in the right direction. But again, coming back to the beginning of our presentation, policy doesn't give the full scope. Just because it's written that way on paper doesn't mean it's working perfectly. But for myself, at least, if we're not integrating the changes within our infrastructure and our municipal corporations, if you will, to better align the directives and the operational measures that take place in there, and, you know, all the rules that are applied and all the other stuff that I'll get the wrong words for and twist around, we're not getting anywhere to start with. First, we have to start sculpting it out. And a lot of it is performative, Julian. But until we can kind of realign our municipal views with the communities that they're in and the ethics and the hearts of the people within them, we're not getting anywhere. It's a first step. It's not a final step by any means. Having it in those policies doesn't fix it, you're right. But it is, to me, I view it as a step in the right direction in terms of policy development, which is why it was emphasized.
I want to point out one of the reasons they went so hard after Ruse Island is because Ruse Island, every day, we would have the People's Revolutionary Tribunal where people would come together, discuss what the issues are, what people are facing, and they would be empowered to like promote justice. So in Canada, if someone smashes a window, someone calls the cops, the person's window is broken, it doesn't get fixed, this kid goes to jail, etc., etc., etc. But the way we would do it is if like there would be a trouble, they would come to like one of the organizers, if that couldn't be set up, it would go in front of the whole collective. And the whole collective would come up with a way. So say that you stole $10 from her, then you would go, like I'm just saying, then
She stole from me, man.
okay,
Whatever.
you would go and bring food from the food bank or steal it from one roof or whatever and bring it to the encampment to make up for that. And so the idea would not be to have this punishment view, but to actually fix the problems. And the thing that the city of Kitchener found so destructive about Ruse Island was that we were practicing sovereignty. We had an island where for 1 year we made our own laws, we had our own safe supply, we policed ourselves, we had no serious violent attacks, and like we're talking like at this new encampment so-called
Julian, do you mind if I sneak in? I'm so sorry. I know. I wish.
Again, my thing is, I don't think it's I don't think the issue is to come from the top down. I think we need to organize the people from the bottom to express sovereignty, because when the people from the bottom lift themselves, they lift everyone with them. And I think that if we're talking about dealing with encampments and stuff, we have to talk about empowering the people at the encampments to express political power.
I think, Julian, you're seeing a lot of solidarity for that. You're in the right room, I think, to make that statement. Can I ask a question to folks? Why don't I suggest, is there any, maybe one more question just in direct pursuit to Reagan and Laura's presentation before I flip us over? I see one right over here.
Hi, I'm from Moncton, New Brunswick, and our bylaw definitely is on the cringy or the problematic side of how they're currently doing it. And one thing that we frequently run into as I manage an outreach program is the difference between public land and private land and the different responses from enforcement related to those. And right now, there's very much everyone does get moved along. And so trying to find the inroad of how to change that system. And I think the difference between the private and public is something that comes up frequently. And so also, how do we find out what is this public land and get those different responses, and any insight on that context?
Do you want to go ahead?
Well, I don't know if we got time for this one. I guess first thing to say, I just want to identify, I'm from Ontario, so there may be different applications in New Brunswick that I'm going to have off here. In terms of Ontario, I have been struggling to identify public land for years now. The most honest answer I can give you is best of luck. But realistically, honestly, I thought I had an answer for this. I could talk to you about public and private land for hours. If we meet up, I'd love to. But in terms of locating where to put people, the advice I'd give, I probably shouldn't say on stage.
Yeah, and I will say that I think we focused on public lands because it's a little bit lower hanging fruit in terms of the, you can argue that there's a public obligation there in a way that it's more complicated when it comes to private lands. But it has been an ongoing struggle in different municipalities in Ontario to get municipalities to identify which lands are owned by them, or which lands meet the conditions set out in a protocol. One of the things, anyone here from Guelph? There's a few. So the city of Guelph did actually make a map. I don't know how the map is working in practice, so that's an interesting question. But actually, yeah, which is a step beyond what anyone from Hamilton. No. Okay. So Hamilton advocates have been saying, give us a map of where people can go on public lands, and they have not given a map. So Guelph gave a map, but thumbs down in terms of practice, actual application. So I think it's a tricky question for sure.
You know what I'm going to do? I see that there's a hand over there. I'm going to note you here, and when we go to the larger question period at the end, you're first up. Okay. So next up, I would like to introduce our next set of speakers. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Marie-Josée Houle. So for those who don't know, Marie-Josée is the federal housing advocate, which is kind of a big deal. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about her role there. And then I'd also like to introduce Ian Hamilton. Ian joined the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate as a senior policy advisor in November of 2020. He wants me to stop there, so that's all I'm going to read. Take it away.
Great. Get it on. Oops, I went too far.
Okay. Great. Oh, good morning, bonjour. I've been introduced. You can call me MJ Marie. I answer to a lot of things. I grew up in Alberta, so not many people call me Marie-Josée. So, how people address me is more about the person than about me. So I'm really pleased to be here with you this morning. And thanks so much, Michelle, for the land acknowledgement. You can't talk about a housing crisis without talking about an Indigenous crisis. So this is really what it boils down for me in the work that I do every single day as Canada's first federal housing advocate. Malheureusement, nous disposons pas des traductions simultanées, mais nous ferons notre présentation en anglais, mais nous serons heureux de répondre aux questions en français. Veuillez noter que nous avons également fourni des diapositives en français aux organisateurs de la conférence. So in February of 23, I launched my first ever federal housing advocate led review, and it focused on the human rights situation of people living in encampments. And I delivered my report and recommendations the following year on February 13th of 24, and I'm now engaged in monitoring the follow-up of my recommendations. So last year, my team was able to present at the CAH conference in Halifax on my interim report, which featured really what we heard. And Ian, the amazing engineer of this work and the lead of this work, we're going to provide an overview of my recommendations and an update on the federal government's response so far. So it's my hope that this information can assist you in your local advocacy for a human rights-based response to encampments in your communities. So my report, I concluded that governments are not fulfilling their human rights obligations. So the human rights of encampment residents are not being protected, and the basic needs of encampment residents are not being met. Encampment evictions and clearances do violate human rights, increasing isolation and risks of harm. Overrepresentation of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in encampments are everywhere. And Black and other racialized individuals, women, 2 SLGBTQI plus individuals, people fleeing domestic or violence or gender-based violence, youth, seniors, and people with disabilities are at much greater risk. Shelters are inaccessible for many and are not an adequate solution. And people do not have access to adequate housing as well as the services and supports that they need. So we should all be able to agree that encampments, they're not a solution. So this report is not a pro-encampments report. But while the solution is housing, it's adequate housing, it's appropriate housing. But until that's there, encampment residents, their rights need to be recognized, and we need a human rights-based approach. So everyone has a right to adequate housing, and we need to really concerted action at all levels to get there. But until that housing with supports is available, we really need to take action to protect the life, the dignity, and the human rights of people living in encampments. So my report really was a call to action, a call for leadership at all levels of government, and a plea to avoid politicizing the issue. Encampments are a national phenomenon. They're everywhere. So it's not just Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. I did a lot of work in northern Saskatchewan. I've been to the very far north, and even on the edge of the Arctic Circle. Encampments are everywhere in Canada. And, because it's a national issue, we are really calling for a national response. So my report called for increased federal leadership to bring all governments to the table, to put in place urgent and, most importantly, coordinated response where the right hand knows what the left hand is doing and not acting in a silo. And so it called on governments to take urgent action to ensure people have all basic necessities of life, to stop forced evictions on public lands, to meaningfully engage with encampment residents, to implement, UNDRIP, and uphold Indigenous rights, to recognize and hold Canada's basic human rights obligations, to accelerate offer of permanent housing options and address the root causes of encampments. Without that, we're just going to shuffle people along and harm them even more in the process. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ian, and who's going to carry on this conversation a little bit more.
So thanks, Marie-Josée, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm going to share some more details about the calls to action that Marie-Josée just spoke to. And I think you're going to hear some things that you'll recognize from our earlier presentation from Reagan and Laura. And I think that underlines the fact that what they are seeing in Ontario, and as Marie-Josée said, is reflected across the country. So it really is a national phenomenon. And that's why that's one of the reasons why there's an important role for the federal government in terms of bringing together all the actors and making sure resources are available. So the advocate in her report, Marie-Josée, called for a national encampments response plan that would be in place before this coming winter. So the governments are going to need to act quickly. That plan needs to be consistent with a human rights-based approach. Importantly, it needs to include new resources, not reshuffling resources from other programs that are addressing homelessness already, but new focused resources to assist in dealing with encampments. And it needs, as I said, a strengthened collaboration and coordinated and consistent response from all levels of government. And that means talking about federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, but it also means engaging Indigenous governments. Like we heard earlier in the last presentation, there's a urgent need for governments to act to respond to the basic needs of people who are living in encampments. The right to life includes the right to live in dignity, as well as the protection of one's physical and mental health. While we still have shortages of housing and accessible shelter spaces, there's a need to ensure that people who are living unhoused have available to these basic needs and to live in dignity. So some of these include clean water, sanitation, food, heating and cooling in the summer, healthcare, harm reduction services. And for a more complete list, you can obviously go to the SHIFT's municipal engagement guidance that talks more about this. We also talked earlier about evictions. And this is a sticking point for many, but it's critical if we're going to change the conversation around how we respond to encampments. Forced evictions are a violation of human rights. And this was highlighted in our report. So rather than evicting people, we need to see governments investing resources in finding alternatives that are developed following meaningful engagement with encampment residents. And that means meeting with people to learn about their needs and ensuring that the responses that are put in place are actually addressing those needs. We heard again and again from people across the country that forced evictions don't actually work. They do nothing to address the underlying issues. They may move people along and give neighbors a sense of comfort that the city is doing something, but in fact, those people generally remain homeless and unhoused. They may set up elsewhere. They may go to a shelter for a little while, but often they're back on the street within a few weeks. We also heard a lot about the harm that is caused when forced evictions take place, and we heard earlier about that. Often these are groups that have already experienced trauma and eviction. Often these involve police forces and can make trauma worse. And they also can lead to more isolation, so that people don't have the community there to support them, whether it's in case of their consumption or in case of protection from the elements. Often in forced evictions, people lose the very things they need to survive, whether it's tents, sleeping bags, warm clothes, or their irreplaceable personal items that help give them a sense of who they are and help help them to live in dignity. And importantly, when governments take an enforcement approach, it undermines the trust that is actually needed for governments to work with people and move them towards housing solutions. So it's actually counterproductive when people are relying on enforcement. And as we heard earlier, it's really important that we understand that if we're taking a human rights-based approach, which means supporting the dignity and the autonomy of the person, it must mean that governments respect the rights of encampment residents to decide for themselves which housing solutions best meet their needs, including for safety and security. So we heard earlier that some protocols may mention meaningful engagement, but none of them describe it. And I think if there was one thing that we heard and wanted to underline and feel is the most important path towards effective response to engagements, it is meaningful engagement with those encampment residents. It's the only way we can find long-term solutions. And that these are solutions that must actually result in an actual improvement in someone's situation, not just moving them to another place or putting them at risk. Top-down approaches don't work. And if people are choosing encampments, it's usually because it's the best option that they feel is available to them. I mentioned the importance of building trust. I think the way meaningful engagement is approached, it needs to be different from our typical consultation processes. We heard about some oopses. We need to avoid practices that will create resistance. We need to be honest. We need to follow through on commitments. And I think anyone who's engaging in a meaningful engagement process, whether it's a service provider or our government needs to recognize that this takes time, that it's a new approach. We need to build our capacities in this area. It takes time, it takes resources if we want to see it being effective. As Marie-Josée said, the encampments crisis is an Indigenous crisis. And it's important that when we're looking at our responses to encampments, we're not looking at them in isolation. The response to encampments needs to go hand in hand with implementation of the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This means providing support for Indigenous governments to provide self-determined, culturally appropriate housing and supports to their citizens regardless of where they reside. Responses to encampments must be accompanied by substantially increased investments in adequate, sustainable, and culturally appropriate housing in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And we must ensure engagement with Indigenous peoples to more effectively respond to the distinct need of urban First Nations, Inuit, and Métis individuals, particularly those who are unhoused and living in encampments. So the need for these things to first be included in protocols, but then be practiced, as we heard earlier. It's not enough just to have them in writing. And in terms of not operating in silos, solutions to encampments must include offers of permanent adequate housing as well as actions to prevent homelessness. So we need to be looking at solving encampments as part of solving the overall housing crisis. The goal should be to rehouse people in an adequate housing that they have a say in as rapidly as possible. Encampments are not the solution, housing is a solution. And in the absence of adequate housing, we need to look at those structural barriers in the emergency shelter system, which are preventing people from accessing those shelters. So we need to be working on that. But again, shelters can't be seen as a solution either. We also need to be looking at the root causes of encampments, including systemic racism and discrimination, and addressing the failings in systems related to child welfare, social assistance, corrections, and healthcare. And finally, we need to continue to increase and enhance the national housing strategy and put a greater emphasis on ending homelessness for all people. So I'll turn it back to Marie-Josée.
Thank you. So we're pleased that the federal government has responded to a number of our recommendations. The minister's housing plan and federal budget in April 24 announced new funding for a human rights-based community action plan. And as required by legislation, the minister provided a formal written response to my report and recommendations. And my team and I have also followed up. We've had follow-up conversations with the minister, his staff, and the department. September 22nd, there was an announcement to launch formal negotiations with provinces and territories, and the statement last week that the federal government is prepared to negotiate directly with municipalities if provinces do not recognize the urgency for action. So on October 3rd, I released a statement which welcomed the commitment of this new federal funds and effort to engage provinces and territories. I also raised several concerns, highlighting some gaps in the public announcement so far. And in particular, I'm concerned that the federal government has not released guidelines regarding what constitutes a human rights-based approach to encampments. There's that reluctance to use those words, and it is really disconcerting to me. And it should be troublesome for all of you out there too. And we need to ensure the limited resources available, because it's not a lot, that are going to communities that have a genuine commitment to the protection and advancement of human rights. And we need action on forced evictions. So my report recognized that encampments should not be seen as a solution. At the same time, it reminds governments that forcibly evicting people living in encampments is a violation of international human rights law, and it causes more harm. And instead of forced evictions, governments have to engage with encampments residents to find solutions that include adequate housing that meets their needs. There is no one out there who is a better expert on their own experience than the people who are actually living it. This is an untapped resource. It's not about you should, you must. It is about that person and why they're making the choices that they're making, because it is a choice. It's a terrible choice. It's a terrible choice among a lot of terrible options, but it is a choice all the same. And we need to understand why. And so, I really reiterate my call for the prohibition of forced evictions, and I urge the federal government to lead on this issue by putting in place a moratorium on forced evictions on federal lands and by prohibiting the use of the new program funds to support forced evictions and other police-led responses. And I also urge provinces, territories, and municipalities to follow suit. So at minimum, human rights-based community action plans really need to include measures to protect the life, the dignity, and human rights of people who are unhoused and living in encampments, including essential services such as clean drinking water, electricity, healthcare, harm reduction, heating and cooling, sanitation, cooking facilities, and waste collection. And about waste collection, all of us that are housed, we have people that come to our homes every week or every 2 weeks to pick up our garbage. Why is that expectation, put on the backs of people who are just every single day of their lives about their mere survival? And I want to leave you with that when you get complaints about garbage. These actions also need to be transparent, human right-based protocols by enforcing bylaws, or for the enforcing bylaws, and a commitment to repealing bylaws which contribute to criminalization and insecurity of encampment residents, and to ending practices like coercive cleanup actions or including the confiscation of belongings that people need to survive and live in dignity. It might be deemed from the outside that this is garbage, but for the person that owns these, this is their tools of survival. And we also need meaningful engagement of encampment residents in the designation or the design, the implementation, the decision-making and evaluation of human rights-based community action plans. Finally, we need recognition of acute overrepresentation of Indigenous people experiencing homelessness and living in encampments, and the meaningful engagement of Indigenous governments and organizations in the action plans in line with the obligations under UNDRIP. So as I prepare to wrap up my first mandate in February, I'm going to continue monitoring government follow-up and advocate for recommendations to be implemented. And recognizing that governments, particularly municipal governments, they need the support to build their capacity. And I also plan on releasing a number of resources. So one of the next month, my office and I will be publishing a report on the current state of Canadian jurisprudence, which is entitled Encampments and Legal Obligations, Evolving Rights and Relationships. And in the new year, because we keep talking about what meaningful engagement means, we're going to be releasing some fact sheets and that document good practices, so that for those who really want to do this, know that they will be on the right path and doing it right. And on that note, really, thank you so much. We really do look forward to your questions, but before we get to the questions, I want to leave you with this. We want these government commitments, and there's a lot of them. We heard the minister speak this morning, right? The commitments and the implementation sometimes are two worlds apart. And it'll take all of us advocates here today. We need to work together to ensure a follow through on these commitments. And we need to make sure that they result in significant improvements in the lives of the people that we're serving. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Marie-Josée and Ian. We now have a solid 25 minutes for questions. So what I will do is I will open up the floor to folks' questions, and they can be, I think, for all 4 of the panelists, I'll suggest. I know there was a question over here earlier. Would you like to take the floor first?
I guess it was more an observation. So I live in Kitchener, and one of the things that I find really interesting is that it took a significant amount of work and time to even have something as crucial as economic status of a human being to be part of an equity bylaw. So there seems to me to be a real misunderstanding of the intersectionality and the layering of the factors that would lead someone to become homeless and unsheltered within those structures, and how and the process of trying to get that they were very successful, but that took a massive amount of work. So if the actual bodies, the legislating bodies at the local level are working that slowly to even bring that forward, then it makes it pretty hard at the implementation level to realize it on a practical scale. So it does force individuals and people at the grassroots level sometimes to have to break laws.
Yep.
And then that creates a terrible situation of vulnerability that I think is really important in this gap of making sure that we are truly coming from a human rights approach. So that was just something I wanted to address in that part of that. The other thing was the lands issue. Extracting information about land
Is there a
is
database?
the hardest thing in the world to do. And you get these blank, funny looks on the bureaucrats you're dealing with. They're all very nice people. But I swear, all of a sudden, they go from hi to this. I do. And I would say that, is that a golden handcuff? Like, I don't understand what that is. But to me, it should be one of the easiest things for me to do, which is go to my municipality and say, hey, what lands belong to the municipality? That should not be hard to do, and that should come within a week to 2 weeks of a request. How many years has it been now?
Wow.
2 years, I think.
Oh no, COVID at least. We're hit before.
So that is something, I don't know if the federal or the whoever can pressure for that to happen in a mutually accountable way. I think that that is really important. And the last thing I want to say is that I question this idea of public land. And the reason why I'm questioning it is because the municipalities function from an enforcement place and a barrier place as if it's corporate land. And so if we cannot address the fact that it is considered corporate land, so when they enforce from a corporate understanding of the world, which equates to private land ultimately, then we have a really serious problem, because the minute that anybody does anything, they are now subject to potential criminalization. And I can say at 150 Main in Cambridge, for example, the idea of voluntary enclosure I would call coercive enclosure. So people were removed after fences were put up. Now the fences were agreed to by the encampment, if I remember right, by parts of the encampment. But then there was this winnowing process over time where then people were displaced to a park. Is a park public or corporate land? Let's understand that, right? Where they then displaced people, and that was the pretext for removing them. And that was a forced eviction. So there, I just needed to say that.
I got to chime in after my lady Heather there. Who's public? Does that not include all of our community members, housed or not? So when we're talking about public land, why is it viewed quite often as only being something that's to be accessed by those who have a brick and mortar home? Respectfully, we really need to start redefining some of our terminologies, and like in a lot of this stuff, I find that our terminologies are far too broad or subjective, as opposed to being defined the way corporations seem to usually like it when they don't want to have like clear parameters because it's to their benefit. It's very, very subjective.
And we know too that in Cambridge, they use drones
Oh,
to
Lord.
hunt the people down and find them in the bushes. And then they report them to a website that then goes to the city government, and that's where the city government enforces eviction. So let's be honest.
Is that just like private citizens?
Yes, they have it all set up.
Okay, after that mic drop moment. Any other questions from folks in the room? Oh, yep, Alexi, go for it.
Thanks, Alexi White with Main Street. I have a question about maximum available resources. It's a little technical, but the housing that Canada's agreed to includes progressive realization up to this idea of maximum available resources. And so I'm wondering, have you seen any levels of government, this is binding on all levels of government, that have done a good faith analysis of whether they are in fact acting up to the maximum available resources that are required to address this problem? And what do we need to do to bring out that aspect of the right to housing? It feels like so much of the lack of resources that are being put toward this issue has to do with the fact that we have budgeting processes, and the way we think about money and anything about resources in a municipality or any other level of government is so divorced from the human rights realities of what they're supposed to be doing. How do we change that?
I think that's the $64,000 question if we're talking about budgets. I'll use a money analogy. I don't think there's any government in Canada and very few around the world that's really taking their economic, social, and cultural rights obligations seriously enough, and particularly that piece. I think that's part of the advocacy that we need to do in Canada to actually make sure that all levels of government understand what they've committed themselves to. And that will require a fair amount of monitoring to be able to know what some of those numbers are, what some of those investments are. I think there are times when you can make an argument that we're using Ontario as an example, and I don't know all the details, I'm from Montreal, but giving a $200 rebate to everyone in a province versus investing in housing and homelessness, whether that's a violation of the obligation to use maximum available resources. So I think we need to equip ourselves better with understanding as sort of a movement, and then be better at advocating for the government and keeping an eye on them, holding them accountable.
Right before I go to the next question, which I'm going to go right over to you over here, I'm just going to do a quick shameless plug and take the moderator's privilege. So I'm coming from the National Right to Housing Network. Speaking of advocacy, if you're interested in getting engaged in some advocacy around this, we at the National Right to Housing Network have a advocacy push coming up soon. Our staff team have shamelessly put the QR code for our newsletter on the back of our t-shirts. And so if at any point in time, there's Jessica and Misha looking really embarrassed right now. But if you want to sign up for the NRHN newsletter, just keep an eye out, because we are going to have a pretty cool call to action coming out soon to help folks do some serious advocacy exactly on the points that Ian just mentioned there. And after that shameless plug, I'm now going to go to the question right over here.
I think our municipality was some of your yikes on the group slideshows. I guess my question is that you mentioned tools of survival. We work very closely with our bylaw officers, and we try to work with them very well, but I was trying to advocate more for human rights. What would your response be to structures not being able to be put up? Only tents, so if you start to build your structure, it's now breaking some kind of bylaw that they have to put it down, and it causes safety issues. So that's why it's being asked. I'm just wondering what other municipalities are doing in those cases.
I really want to recognize that when we talk about municipal policy, municipalities are not unitary entity. Like, there are lots of folks doing good work within municipalities and trying to push practices further towards human rights. So thanks for the work that you're doing. It's tricky because I would probably, I guess there's two roads of appeal. There's the compassionate appeal, which is, look, this person, nobody really chooses to live in an encampment if they have meaningful and appropriate alternatives. And I think we need to hammer that home. So this person making adjustments to their structure to enable their survival, that should be seen as an element of their fundamental basic right to try and survive and make shelter. And I probably would say that based on some of the legal cases, I would be really concerned about potentially a charter violation coming through. I don't know that that actually has meaning in terms of day-to-day engagement with bylaw though, right? And so I think questions around trying to understand the basis of the complaint, right? Is someone what's the concern really, right? Is a neighbor complaining? Is there a way we can talk to that neighbor? Is it just someone who's really set on enforcing the rule of law as written, right? Can we talk about some flexibility? Can we talk about maybe this isn't okay, but we can meet somewhere midway through, right? And unfortunately, that's not really satisfactory because rights should not be negotiations. But I think in terms of the reality on the ground, that's my thought. I don't know, I think Reagan might have some thoughts on this.
I feel like all my thoughts run away when I sit at this table. I guess I just want to kind of note shifting our perspective of liability. I feel like a lot of the time what we're dealing with is that there's concern about who's going to be liable if something happens.
Yeah.
Who's going to be liable if you move that person and that causes something to happen? There's still that shift of we need to shift our perspective of what liability is and kind of shove it in the back corner. A lot of the time when I'm jumping up the chain and stuff, it feels like once we get to the lawyer people, that's when there's no more conversation to be had because, good Lord, we can't do that. We might be liable. Well, respectfully, you're still liable. These are your citizens. These are your residents. This is your community. You're still liable for maintaining the well-being of these individuals. So kind of shifting our perspective to community health being part of the liability as opposed to using liability as a restrictive method. And also on the sheltering thing, a lot of what I end up hearing is kind of the other regulatory entities coming into place, well, we can't have this because then we have building code and things like that. These aren't perfect situations. We've got to really start perceiving things from the perspective of the person there as opposed to our own. What you might not consider adequate for the moment, they might. And if you're looking at it through your own eyes, you're not going to be happy with your answer. But if you ask them what they'd like or what they need or whether this is in their comfort zone, you'll get somewhere else. And that would be the right direction to head.
Thanks so much, Reagan. Ooh, put that on a t-shirt. That's a good answer.
I don't even remember what I said.
It was really good. Okay, I see a couple of different hands in the room. I'm gonna go here, and then Julian. So let's start here.
Okay, hi. I first wanted to start off by just saying that both of the presentations were really well done and really clear, so I hope you give yourselves a pat on the back. I wanted to ask a question. This is open to all of you. But to me, something that I truly believe that is perpetuating homelessness and the crisis is the negative discourse on people facing homelessness. And that's something that you both touched on. But now we see these new bylaws, like in Waterloo on anti-discrimination. So I'm wondering if you can predict or kind of give us your thoughts on the interaction between these new bylaws, like the anti-discrimination bylaw in Waterloo and charter rights, in helping flipping that script on people facing homelessness so that we can create a more positive discourse and prioritize their needs more.
That's a big one.
Yeah. Would you like to go first?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm going to address your question directly, but there is a trend right now that is terrifying me, really. It's about weaponizing compassion. Right? Oh, these poor people, we can't let them languish like this, and it's inhumane to let them live like this. Therefore, we're going to strip them of their autonomy, their self of independence, their ability to make proper decisions, because we're seeing a lot of this language come out of BC and Alberta right now, which is, where we want rights for everyone and, rights to autonomy, bodily autonomy, except for these people, right? And that dichotomy is really being pushed as an anti-human rights position. And so it took us 3 years to socialize the language of human right to housing. To even have a federal minister call it housing crisis was a big deal. We heard it this morning. He said human rights a few years ago, didn't say it this morning. So this is an uphill battle. We need to keep pushing, but we need people to understand what that is. And it can't be turned into this thing that is about, a dirty word, which again, I'm seeing. It's a woke. There's an accusation there, right? So part of it is education. Part of it is we need to not be embarrassed to use those words. But then people need to understand what it looks like on the ground when it's being practiced appropriately, and then finally see the results. But when we get commitment light, Canada's really good at commitments, but the implementation is light. Housing first, light. And, they need to follow through. And this is the role that we all need to do. And not be embarrassed to use the words human rights. It is a comms exercise. Michelle, I can't wait to see your campaign, but it is, not letting those terms be sullied or weaponized, and certainly not letting compassion be weaponized against people. And I think I totally went off track. So I'm going to hand this over if you want to reframe your question so that others can add to the conversation.
I think if I'm understanding, it's like, how do we bridge that gap, right? And I think for me, part of the answer is just around grassroots community organizing. Like, why I find policy interesting and not just purely performative is that it can be used as like a little bit of a wedge, maybe a small hammer or mallet to kind of force people, this is what you say you're going to do, and we're going to use that, but you won't do it on your own, right? We need folks to hold you accountable. And you're right, the broader stigma around issues of homelessness. And it's funny because the stigma doesn't even make logical sense. We have to believe absurd things. We have to believe that people have real options, but they somehow like sleeping in parks in -0 and totally inadequate. It doesn't make sense. It actually doesn't make sense. And any housing service provider will tell you that there's a crisis of affordable housing units, a crisis of options for folks, right? And so I think those are sort of the two pieces. One, trying to work to dismantle some of that stigma, and the other is working to build those networks of community and support to hold folks accountable and demand action.
Okay, I think we have another question. It was back here. Yes, right back here. Go for it.
You kind of answered my question in your last piece, to be honest with you, because it's the narrative that's the difficulty as well. Where I live on the West Coast, and weaponization is becoming much more common than it ever was. And so there is some concern about that. And also, I'm even respectfully, both of your presentations were phenomenal. Thank you so much for putting the time and the effort in. In our desire to do this work, though, we often forget actually the people that we're talking about. It's an us versus them kind of discussion, despite our best efforts not to have that be. And so I do have some concerns about, how we are working together in such a way that brings people, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I recently witnessed a film that was done on Vancouver Island. I live on Vancouver Island, where a videographer went into an unhoused encampment and made friends and followed the journey of a person's experience living in the encampment. And some of the things that came from that film were so extraordinary, and one of them in particular was that as we have our us versus them mentality, for them, that is home. It is home that is their encampment. It is home that the tarp is the roof over their head. It is home because they've created community within the encampment, and that community within the encampment is absolutely broken apart in such a traumatic way that people are recovering not only from the experience of having to go there, but for the first time, and some of these people going into encampment are reaching out to community within themselves. They're self-governing, they're self-creating, they're finding ways to empower their situation, and then government comes along and says, no, we're not doing that, and they rip it down. And so I think that we're still neglecting the piece is that just because we're used to living with 4 walls and a roof over our head doesn't make us the authority on what is real for community within persons that live unhoused. And so I am really concerned about the narrative in every way that we speak to this, whether it's in our presentations, in our conversations. You know, we are continuing the us versus them mentality as long as we remain uninclusive.
Thank you for that.
Okay, we still have another few minutes. I think, Julian, you were next on the list, so you go. I'll give you maybe a minute and then hop to someone else.
So I just want to be clear, we're dealing with class over here and we're dealing with genocide. And what I mean is in Kitchener, over the last 2 months, we've had all sorts of poisons in the drug supply, particularly the opioid supply, and people are dying, the naloxone isn't working, and the only place where people can go and get their drugs tested, sanguine, is getting shut down by Rockford, despite the fact that the city has no problems and nothing. Meanwhile, the police is sweeping people off the streets, this and this and this. If we look at the UN definition of genocide, which is to attack a physical group, to assimilate or destroy, that's what they're doing. So let's not kid ourselves. What's happening is genocide. From when I started organizing in 1998, everyone I know who wasn't a student, the students all got jobs, but all the homeless people I organized with back then, all my friends are dead or in jail. So it is genocide, and it is internment by remand, the same way they're doing it in Ireland. The thing I want to address is the issue of structures. So we were working with the region, and you were there, and they gave us money to build structures, and then we started building sandbag houses. So we got like $4,000. We were able to run a tent city for 1 year, get this woman to take care of 20 kids after going through CAS shit and whatever, so she could take care of the kids. And we wanted to build a structure at Vic and Weber, which is the encampment. And they came up with all these reasons why we can't. They stopped us in mid-thing, even though they were funding us. And so then we found a loophole. Like, if you guys play D&D, every spell has a loophole, every law has a loophole. It's the same sort of thing, so you have to look for the loophole. And they kept on saying, oh, these are unsafe, whatever. You go there now, you see a house built out of sandbags that costs less than $400. Well, the sand might have been about $1,000, but like really damn cheap, like to run these 3 projects. But at every turn, it was the region that was criminalizing us. So let's not kid ourselves. It's called the Corporation of Kitchener for a reason. Like, gentrification of the downtown core has been happening for a long time, and that's costing deaths. So to the person who was talking about building structures, build them, build the community support, take over the narrative, build it in a bloody public space. Like when the IRA was having their campaign for civil rights and no one was paying attention, they started bombing Britain. And then everyone paid attention because no one gives a fuck if Irish people are dying in Belfast, but once British people are dying, then it becomes a thing. We follow the same logic. You know, Victoria Park is where they make Murdoch Mysteries and all these cool shows and stuff. It's like the center of the city. That's where we built our encampment. So find a place, build the structure, control the narrative, and resist, because no one gives anything for free. And the only reason why there is safe injection site in Kitchener was because years before, people like myself took tents in front of the region and just fucking did it. And they said they'd arrest us, we'd be like, sure, throw us in jail. We're going there anywhere, right? We might as well go to jail or die for a reason instead of like die for nothing.
Thanks, Julian. Thank you for the comment. I think I'm going to wrap folks up because we have 2 minutes left. And I'm going to look to the panelists and say, any final comments in our last 2 minutes?
Well, everybody looks at me because if you know me, I talk a lot normally. Quiet today. Let's stop the separation from self. Let's stop pretending it couldn't happen to us. Let's stop pretending that the person who has no home, it's their fault, because if it's not their fault, it could happen to me. Because the reality is, we are in a climate crisis as well. It's not unforeseen that there's potential that anybody in this room could be stuck like the same individuals we're talking about without even their basic needs met. And I guess the only other thing I'm gonna say, because I'm trying to keep it short, actually there's 3 circled, I'll really try. Shoot for solidarity. You're not there to be anybody's savior. They don't want a savior. They want someone who's gonna walk with them, be their friend, work it out with them, not do it for them. These are not children. And I just want to kind of tout a little bit on what Julian said there. In addition to the climate crisis, we are facing a deep duality of crisis. A lot of things are coming together and hitting at the same time. So if you thought you knew anything about these situations 5 years ago, guess what? You don't know more. Start doing your research. Look at all the different impacting factors, because it is not so simple as it was once. And it's not getting any simpler. I will try to be quiet and move on here. Anybody else?
That was a pretty good mic drop moment, Reagan. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, you know what? I'll ask folks to join me in thanking the panelists. What an excellent session today. I think I'm going to do one more shameless plug. There are 4 other Right to Housing Stream sessions in this conference. I heard this rumor that they're the best ones. I don't know. But for example, this afternoon, there's an Ask Me Anything session on the right to housing we're doing, where we're encouraging folks to come with your questions about the right to housing. We also have a session this afternoon where we're talking about the intersections of youth, homelessness, and evictions and the right to housing. So I want to encourage folks to do that. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter by finding the shameless plug on our t-shirts. Thanks so much, everyone.